Okay, it works. Okay, we're going to start. I was already threatened that if we don't start on time, it's very bad. So I'm just going to start and people can come in. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Today's event is titled Markets for Nature, a Global Index for Biodiversity. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to take 1 minute to tell you who we are. So my name is Edoardo Chiarotti. I'm a scientific collaborator at Enterprise for Society. See the banner here. The Enterprise for Society is a center, an academic center that was born from a joint venture between University of Lausanne, IMD, and a PFL. And this is our mission, so we aim to inspire and activate the transition to a resilient and inclusive economy within the planetary boundaries, always mindful, of course, of the scientific and technological change. Today's event was born from a collaboration that we, or a PFL, have with ETH, or the Crowder Lab. And this is a scientific collaboration that is interdisciplinary. So the ETH Crowder Lab that then Tom Elliott will present to you are the ecologists, and we are at the PFL the economists. And we kind of came together to start thinking about a project on biodiversity that has basically two objectives. One is measuring the impact and it's measuring biodiversity, and then the impact of corporations and nature-based solutions on biodiversity, right? And then the second objective that this project has is creating market instruments from biodiversity restoration. Okay, so that's a research project that is behind this event, and then today, so the event will be about showcasing how scientists have been thinking about these things. So I'm going to let Tom now introduce the Crowder Lab. Thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo. Thank you. I'll speak here. Hi, everybody. So I'd like to start my presentation with just a simple survey. Please raise your hands if you started this morning with a cup of coffee. Excellent. So I think you're going to enjoy this. The drink that so many of you started your day with has its roots in the Kaffa region of Ethiopia, and coffee is still being grown there today. In fact, you can see a coffee cultivation here. The forest has been cleared to make room to plant coffee trees, but in order to grow quickly and yield a big crop, they need pesticides and fertilizers, as well as water, and lots of it. As much as 140 litres are needed to grow the beans for a single cup of coffee. Now, I don't want to pick on these particular farmers, I just want to show you a typical example of how agriculture works all over the world. It's typical because it works, at least for a while. Pesticides, fertilizers, and irrigation do increase crop yields, and so a vicious cycle begins. More land clearing, more deforestation, more degradation, until biodiversity, soil fertility, water resources, and human livelihoods are depleted. In fact, a recent UN report states that the biggest cause of land degradation worldwide is agriculture, but it's also an area of huge opportunity. Now, I'd like to show you another coffee farm in this same region. I know, you can't see it. It looks just like a forest. That's kind of the point. Meet Desta Kabede. He's originally he's from Ethiopia, and like me, he lives in Zurich, where he has a business selling the coffee grown on this farm. Here, Desta plants native coffee trees in the sunny patches of a beautiful rainforest. The surrounding ecosystem traps water and nutrients, which allow the coffee trees to grow and produce berries without irrigation or fertilizer. Biodiversity in the surrounding forest thrives, which is good for the forest, which is good for his coffee crop, and good for the local people that work on the farm. Now what we're finding is that other people from the local community and other farmers are also getting interested in protecting the forest for the benefit of their own crop. What we're starting to see here is the beginning of a virtuous cycle, where protecting nature leads to protecting more nature. Scientists call these virtuous and vicious cycles feedback loops, where a process reinforces itself. Feedback loops underpin all of the major forces of nature. They led to the formation of stars, the evolution of species, and the explosion of humans across our planet. Even our own human behaviors are constantly reacting to feedback loops, which is why the rich get richer the poor get poorer, and nature gets more and more depleted. Now, the crazy thing is that our planet hasn't always been inherently habitable. In fact, it was a pretty brutal place. Barren rock, volcanoes, noxious gases, you couldn't have even breathed the air back then. That is until something unexpected and transformative happened. Life emerged. We still don't know precisely how it happened, but around 3.5 billion years ago, primitive bacteria started to develop and spread all over the world. Eventually, primitive cyanobacteria started releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. This relatively simple process transformed the atmosphere and enabled other oxygen-dependent life forms to develop. Once these species evolved, each new species transformed the environment a little more, enabling more new species to emerge. Over millions and millions of years, this feedback loop formed an immense interconnected web of interactions where every species needs other species to survive. They all need each other to live on, to live under, to eat, to pollinate, even to fight. That's right. Fighting actually facilitates life on the planet and growth of communities. In our lab, when we put two fungi on a petri dish, one of them almost always immediately kills the other, and the whole system collapses. But when we add a third species, that new species often attacks the dominant individual, enabling the weaker species to survive. It's like a multiplayer rock, paper, scissors, where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the more competitors that we put into the arena, the more likely we are to find these loops that increase the chances that all species survive. The bigger these networks are, the more biodiversity or the more diversity they can support. Life really does lead to more life. At the global scale, these biodiversity feedbacks even regulate the climate. Diverse environments, they lock away carbon, which leads to a more stable climate, which benefits biodiversity, which leads to a more stable climate, and so on. The more biodiversity we have, the more stable this cycle becomes. And it's this feedback loop that has led to the favorable, stable climate conditions that have allowed us to thrive, which means that biodiversity is our life support system. The problem is that, as we are all aware, humans are breaking this essential cycle. Our exploitative approach to growth is degrading the very ecosystems that we rely on, and we risk turning them back into those lifeless landscapes. By now, we have lost about half of Earth's forests, and less than 3% of our ecosystems remain in their natural interconnected state. The problem is that the more we exploit, the more we grow. This relatively new feedback loop is only a couple of centuries old, but it's already grown beyond our control, and it's now leading to the acceleration or development of new environmental feedback loops, which are also accelerating out of control. The power of these global feedbacks is overwhelming and intimidating, and as individuals, it can feel impossible to push against them because they are so powerful. But, and this is the but that drives all of our work at Crowther Lab, rather than push against these feedbacks, we want to try and work with them to find opportunities for positive change. Now, we consider that nature holds many of the seeds needed to drive this change. And as scientists, we're really just starting to get a handle on the scale of the opportunity. Tom Crowther's now going to come up, or shortly going to come up, and talk a little bit more about the science behind our findings, most recent findings, but also to talk about how our ability to quantify value and monitor biodiversity can help projects like Desta's coffee shop that we talked about earlier, as well as 125,000 other projects that are registered with our platform, Restore. Now, our biodiversity scientists are obviously going to play a really important role in interpreting and contextualizing the vast amounts of environmental data that exist. But if we're going to successfully integrate all of that data into financial systems, we're going to need the experience and expertise of individuals like all of you in the room today. And on that note, I'm really excited to introduce a collaborator of ours who is leading the development on the thinking of the evolution and development of nature markets. He's the chair of Nature Finance and your moderator for this session today. Ladies and gentlemen, Simon Zadek.
Thanks. So there's one thing you take out of this session today, it's that anybody who knows Tom, anybody who's called Tom knows a lot, and pretty much everybody else kind of comes second. So thanks, Tom, and we'll have the other Tom in just a moment. Good afternoon. My name isn't Tom, it's Simon Zadek. And I just want to offer a couple of opening remarks, and then we'll kind of kick into the main show. So it's a sort of truism that 100% of our global economy is 100% dependent on nature. And it's a sort of truism, and that at some level sort of doesn't really mean that much, except that it tells us that this isn't just about the things that are obvious, food, for example, or your wooden furniture, but is really about everything around us is made up of all of those nature components on which we depend. And I guess less of a truism and more of a historical fact, is that we've spent hundreds and hundreds of years, particularly as we headed into our industrial phase of civilization, over-exploiting nature, the point that Tom has been making, and gradually driving it into the ground. What does that mean? It means, from a social equity point of view, for example, that we've spent hundreds of years with the terms of reference that terms of trade that effectively underprices nature, overprices the products that it helps to produce, disadvantages those that are the stewards of nature, whether they're individuals, communities, indigenous groups, or indeed nations. So the problem that Tom describes is a problem for nature, but the problem that Tom describes is also a characteristic, if you like, of the civilization and the global economy that we've produced. And then sort of out of, not the blue, but out of the way in which markets have evolved, we're beginning to see, if you like, a next phase. And I'm very cautious in pointing to it optimistically, but let me perhaps describe it in very simple terms, that we're seeing a wave of change where nature is valued and crystallized as having distinct value in the way in which it is traded in global markets, or what nature finance would call nature markets. So all markets have all nature, but nature markets we're talking about where nature in fact isn't implicit, just the secret source of the way in which the global economy works, but is something that is crystallized as a risk, it's crystallized as a financial value, it's traded, might be converted into a financial asset, and traded in its turn, and so on. And that brings with it both an opportunity and a risk. And the opportunity is, as nature becomes more crystallized as a value in the way in which markets function, we have the opportunity to moderate and manage how it is valued, and to moderate and manage the way in which it is traded. And as such, we have the opportunity to moderate and manage and try to mitigate and reduce and obviate the destructive aspects of exploitation of nature, and indeed consider in a more well-governed way the manner in which the economic rewards from the use of nature are distributed across the value chain, if you like, to the different communities of interest that are involved in sustaining nature over time. That's the sort of the good version. And then the really crappy version is that it can all go terribly wrong. That we know that when we value things financially, they can be flipped and tripped and speculated against and turned into derivatives and many other things that we have learned how to do casually in ways that will further destroy nature. So the opportunity as it becomes crystallized is that we govern it more effectively, and the risk is that it simply accelerates the way in which we drive a financialized model into the way nature is conserved, or indeed is not conserved in that case. And that, in a sense, is our opportunity and our challenge. And we're at that cusp of being able to make some real social and political choices. It can't be left to markets, even though markets are innovative and we need to encourage that innovation. We fundamentally have an issue of governance in front of us, and we have some tough and rapid decisions to make. And that's where data becomes important, and that's what brings us here in part today. Yeah, and so data, particularly biodiversity data, has moved from a sort of something that public agencies create, yeah, and there are many public bodies around the world that have long produced enormous amounts of biodiversity relevant data, to a multi-billion-dollar market. Yeah, so exactly what we're seeing happening to nature in the context of markets, not surprisingly, we now begin to see happening to the data about nature, the representation of nature in the way in which it influences many decisions, including decisions about the way nature is valued and traded in markets themselves. And in that context, we once again face a downside and an upside, which is, we can go for a bargain basement approach to what constitutes biodiversity data. Let's see how quickly and cheaply and easily we can sort of get a handle on nature-related risks, nature-related dependencies, nature-related impacts, kind of feed that into the way the financial community makes, reasonably quick decisions. Yeah, drive that into the way, say, a new generation of biodiversity credit markets is going to emerge. And that data will inform decision-making and may, or indeed may not, be helpful in either valuing nature in the right way or driving business and market innovation in ways that actually conserves nature and creates value on the back of a regenerative economy. Or we can go for quality and we can begin to develop data systems and ways of measuring data that inform markets in more sophisticated ways and drive business innovation, financial innovation, market innovation, and indeed policy innovation in ways that really allow us to build a next generation of nature markets that are conserving of nature, as well as creating economic value, prosperity, reasonable distribution of those economic rewards, and so on and so forth. So it's the exact mirror image happening in the data space as is happening in, if you like, the sort of global economy at large. And what brings us here today to this session is one opportunity and a way of thinking about how to avoid that bargain basement approach and how to really think about quality data and the way in which we can jemmy it into a set of global markets that don't always focus on the highest quality that perhaps they should. And so with that, I won't go any further. I'd like to ask the other Tom to talk a little bit about that high quality data opportunity, and then we'll move on to having a couple of panels to kind of figure out whether Tom's story is something that really works in markets, could work in markets, and if so, what it would take to kind of move that agenda forward. Thank you very much indeed. Tom.
Does that work? It does work. Awesome. I get to walk around. Thanks so much, Simon. And Tom gave a perfect introduction into what we're all about. How do I move through the slides? Have you got the clicker?
I refuse.
Oh, you didn't have a clicker? Oh, well, where? Oh, secret. Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, as we're all aware, the biodiversity movement is starting to gain a bit of momentum, and that's wonderful. Our science aims to generate a scientific basis for the protection and the restoration of biodiversity. And the reason it's gaining momentum is due in part to its link with global threats like climate change. And there's no better example of the link between biodiversity and climate than this NASA simulation showing carbon dioxide movement throughout the year, where you can see high concentrations indicated by red in the beginning of the year. But as we tick on into spring and then summer, we see these concentrations fade, and that's due to one simple ecological process. It's the emergence of leaves on trees. This simple process is one of several massive ecological fluxes that balance one another out each year, regulating our climate. And given the massive scale of these systems, managing them effectively is undoubtedly one of our brightest avenues in the fight against global change. But understanding the scale of that potential has been really challenging until recently, because until now, our understanding of the scale of these systems has been generated primarily from satellite data, which has spectacular global coverage, tells us about the greenness and the vegetation cover across our planet. But what it struggles to do is see below the canopy surface. So our research instead focuses on collecting data sets from all across the planet. This should be moving. Where experts have been working on the ground to pull together those data sets across all aspects of different ecosystem characteristics. And by building machine learning and statistical models, we can link that data up with satellite information to explore the spatial patterns in the structure of ecosystems across our planet. Now, that can be incredibly valuable for understanding the scale of biodiversity and its impacts on things like climate change, but also for understanding the localized insights that can help us manage ecosystems effectively. And so our work has focused on many things like the fungal biogeography. We were the first to map the global wood wide web, which some of you might have heard about, the connectivity of global forests across the planet, where we could map how the distribution and functioning of those ecosystems vary with direct implications for how you manage those landscapes. We've also done a lot of work looking at soil microbial communities, bacterial communities in particular, that can be stimulated by warming activity, that as warming happens, the activity of these microorganisms can increase, speeding up the rate of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, which can accelerate the rate of climate change by anywhere between 12 to 17%. Yeah, and it's happening particularly in high latitude regions. But some of our most important work is focused on this, the global forest system, where we can see that our Earth, we mapped the density of global forests, showing that our Earth is home to about 3 trillion trees. And this started to give us an understanding of the scale of these systems. But we could also, using exactly the same models, but trained only on data from protected regions with zero human footprint, predict where trees can naturally exist. And this helps us to see that since the start of human civilization, we have reduced almost half of the global forest system, and about 3% of what remains is in its fully interconnected and intact state. But outside of these areas, and outside of urban and agricultural areas, we could also see that there's about 0.9 billion hectares across the planet where trees might naturally exist. If we could protect these areas, we realize that there's room for about 1 trillion new trees to naturally regenerate. And that word triggers a lot of insights with people, because you might have noticed that when these articles came out a couple of years ago, we identified that these 1 trillion new trees regenerating naturally within intact, healthy ecosystems could capture up to 30% of the excess carbon that's been sitting in the atmosphere as a result of climate change. And this link between biodiversity and climate was both a blessing and a curse for the biodiversity movement. Because, of course, the media went viral, the news spread all over the world. Within moments, the UN had launched their Trillion Tree campaign to go alongside 2 other campaigns with the exact same name from World Economic Forum and WWF. And when governments and companies started pledging their commitment to the restoration of Earth's forests, we thought this is fantastic for the restoration of biodiversity. But of course, there comes the downside. Because of this link with climate, many people also saw this as an opportunity to greenwash, to plant a load of trees and ignore the very real and urgent challenges of cutting emissions and conserving the ecosystems that we still have, which would obviously be devastating for the climate movement. But the mass plantations of trees that we see spreading so readily across the planet are also even more damaging for the biodiversity movement, because they are not only unsustainable, but they destroy all the hundreds of thousands of species that are necessary for the long-term sustainability of those ecosystems. Ultimately, the restoration of Earth's nature is nothing to do with vast plantations of trees. It's about protecting nature where we can, so that allowing it to recover and flourish. And it's also about working with local communities across the planet to find the economic solutions that make nature the economically sustainable option, bringing well-being for people. So in the years since that explosion in 2019, we've been doing a lot of advocacy work, engaging with global markets to try to figure out, to ultimately advocate for the responsible use of nature in nature-based solutions. And we've got to say a huge thank you to the Earthshot Prize and Prince William's Earthshot Initiative for giving us a bit of that platform, along with the TED community. But ultimately, the most valuable connection from this process is that it connected us with hundreds of thousands of local communities, practitioners across the planet who are working directly with nature for their own economic well-being, to promote biodiversity for the communities that depend on it. And through that vast connection of practitioners, we built an online platform to facilitate all of their efforts. It's called Restore. And here you can see Desta's Coffee Jungle, the example that Tom gave earlier, where they're working to produce coffee, but the healthier their ecosystem gets, the more quality their coffee gets, which means they're incentivized to promote the health of those ecosystems. Desta's is a perfect shining example of what a nature-based solution is all about, but it's also the holy grail of what thousands of these projects are trying to achieve. Because it's not always easy to find that economic link between nature and financial stability. Because in fact, the vast majority of these projects are still relying heavily on the production of timber or food or carbon credits in order to find those links. And there's very little that will financially incentivize the protection and health of the ecosystems that they are managing in that process. So it's very difficult to link nature with that economic solution. And this brings us ultimately to the challenge that we've all been facing since the dawn of human civilization. Since we evolved, we have been using the incredible bounty of nature that nature provides. Again, as Tom mentioned, the hundreds of millions of species across the planet that provide all the food, medicines, water, clean air, everything that we need to survive and thrive on this planet, and the inspiration that goes along with it. But ultimately, we're also worriers. Humans tend to worry, and we need a bit of food security. And so, of course, since the start of the agricultural revolution, we've been finding the parts of nature that are edible and propagating them at scale so that we can have good food security, which makes absolute sense, and that has fueled our growth over recent centuries. But of course, this has inherently come at the expense. These vast monocultures of agricultural lands have fed a growing population, but they come at the expense of nature and all the other thousands of services that nature provides, as we all know here. Now, obviously, this has contributed to threats like biodiversity loss and climate change. So in our reaction, what we've tended to do in the last couple of decades is make a new kind of farm. Instead of focusing on food, we're planting vast carbon farms to capture as much carbon as we desperately can. And once again, by focusing on the single metric carbon, this is coming at the expense of the thousands of other services that nature provides and the infinite biodiversity that is our protective food, safety net. So ultimately, the simple lesson that we should have learned from the last couple of centuries is that whenever we extract any particular aspect of biodiversity, any single attribute that biodiversity has, and we value that, that will be propagated at scale at the expense of all other species. And this brings us to the most dangerous point that we're at right now with this sort of burgeoning biodiversity movement. If we build this on any metric that represents one or even a few or just the number of species or any particular oversimplified, aggregated metric of that biodiversity, we are going to propagate that at scale at the expense of the countless other aspects of nature that we so desperately need to survive. Biodiversity is not any one species, it's not any combination of species, it's the infinite network that links every species with every other component of that ecosystem. It's the structure of those ecosystems and the ecological integrity that we need for those ecosystems to build those negative feedback loops that Tom mentioned, to have long-term sustainability that can support all of us. The original definition of biodiversity, is gone. It's essentially the structure of the variability of life across genetic, species, and ecosystem levels. And these are the three levels across which we've been modeling global ecosystems for the last 10 years in the ecological community. And there is a vast and growing body of literature focusing on these different aspects of ecosystem integrity. And so what we can do now in the Crowther Lab is we work across global ecosystems, but for any location on the planet, we can tell you insights about how connected that ecosystem is, how intact it is. We can tell you insights about the number of species that exist there and about the genetic, or in this case, we use the intraspecific trait composition as a metric to represent the genetic variability within those structures. And for each of those layers, we've got hundreds and hundreds of data sets relating to the microbial species, the plant species, and the animal species that comprise those three different levels. And by collapsing all of that data, we can start to gain insights into the structure of ecosystems across the planet. And unfortunately, this is where my presentation totally breaks down, because I thought for ages and ages about how to generate a slide that represents how we collapse all that data together. And and I failed dismally. So I've just been left with this disgusting white slide. All I can tell you is dimensionality reduction is a thing that ecologists, economists, scientists have been doing for a very, very long time. There's loads of different ways to do it. We tend to use approaches like random forest, machine learning approaches, along with principal component analyses and NMDS analyses. These are just some of the multiple different structures of dimensionality reduction that we use. But ultimately, all of these different approaches allow us to collapse lots and lots of layers of information into a single layer. Oh, I really wish it would click on the same. There we go. Into a single layer that can represent the structural and ecological diversity within that structure. And we're calling this the biocomplexity of the ecosystem. And because we can generate those models, as I said earlier, not only for the ecosystem as it is now, but for the way that ecosystem would naturally exist, we can then generate a metric that relates the value of the biocomplexity of this location to its natural state. So this is 98% of, okay, so that one was 98% of its full natural state. And we can obviously do that for any managed landscape across the planet. So here in Switzerland, we can look at the genetic diversity of the plants, the natural forests that exist in the region. We can look at the species diversity, not particularly high in this site, but still we can look at how that diversity varies, and we can look at the connectivity across those forests, along with hundreds and hundreds of other data sets that inform those three levels of information. And with that, we can start to generate a single metric representing that pixel and how it relates to the natural state of that ecosystem across the planet. So this 0.38 says it's about 38% of its natural interconnected complexity. And obviously we can do that for all of the surrounding pixels to generate a map. Now, we don't suggest that it would be best to do this as one single model for the global ecosystem, because our Earth is split into about 850 different ecoregions that have fundamentally unique different characteristics. In fact, if we zoom in here on this particular ecoregion, North America has around 60, I think, different ecoregions, and this ecoregion is one that is made up of about 1.1 million local forest patches. So by zooming in, we can again do the same thing, look at the connectivity of those patches, we can look at the diversity within those patches, and the genetic variability. And by collapsing all this data into a single metric, we can see the biocomplexity of those sites. There we go, the biocomplexity of the sites, and it also starts to highlight regions that we hadn't identified from any individual metric alone about the vulnerability of particular regions where we see that human impact around those edges is having a greater impact than we'd otherwise see. So we can start to see not only the biodiversity around the planet, but also how that biodiversity is impacted by human activity. And because we then link this data up with satellite information, every time the satellite uploads new data, our models change to represent that variation in biogeographic information. So I'm doing something wrong. Yeah, I know. I can't move on. Oh, okay. We've whipped to the end. Oh, it's finished. Okay, so our biocomplexity measure represents this wide variety of by collapsing all of these data sets together, it can be very useful. In fact, maybe I can go back. And that allows us to generate, by piecing all of those data sets together, we can generate that global perspective to be able to, so that any of those practitioners around the world can start to see the biocomplexity, the ecosystem health of their particular location and how it's changing over time. And that helps them to start to put a footprint on that biodiversity, the value of the nature in those regions. And obviously, the reason we're doing this is for the redistribution of wealth to the people who work with nature, who depend on it, so that everyone everywhere can benefit from the values nature provides. And the future steps that we're going to be taking is to make sure that we can increasingly improve this data set by incorporating both local site data from the experts around the world who are monitoring and collecting their sites, but also the qualitative data that can help us to understand the human interpretation of nature, because this is such a critical component of that environmental equity. So I've whipped to the end in a style that I didn't intend to, but I'll hand over for the next stage. Thanks.
Like I said, keep your eye on the toms. That's the way to do it. So, okay, so just before we move, so we've got two panels coming up. Just before we do, I'm just going to get you to move around for a second. So I'd like people who think they understood 100% of that to stand up. Tom, up. You better understand it, mate. Let me tell you, right? Otherwise, we're in deep. All right. People who think they understood 90% or above, stand up. And the hundreds keep standing up. Yeah. People who think they understood more than 50%. Wow. Okay. And people. All right. All sit down. People who now be honest. Be honest. People who felt they sort of understood just a little bit. Stand up. Okay, you've got one honest person in this place. Absolutely. By the way, I'm standing, right? Just so we're clear about this. Okay, thank you very much. Actually, you're all really smart then, so that's really great. I'm super pleased about that. So we have 2 panels now. Thanks, Tom. We have 2 panels now. We have one, if you like, science-based panel, and we have one industry-based panel. And the rules of the game go like this, which I'm going to invite them up, I'm going to ask them some questions, and subject to sort of autocratic rules by me, if anybody wants to raise something or ask a question, they should put their hands up. Yeah, so there's no Q&A session. Yeah, you just got to go, I don't agree with that, right? Or something equally sort of disrespectful. So with that in mind, could I invite the first panel up, Daisy Dent, Rüdiger Fallenbach, Pernilla Hundal, please come up and join us on the stage here, and we will kick on to the first round. Thank you very much. Just help yourself. Yeah, absolutely help yourself. So thank you for joining the panel. I hope you enjoyed the first 2 or 3 segments. And I guess what we're trying to get as a whole from you is a kind of sense of, does this make sense? Yeah. The bottom line is, does this make sense? So Daisy, I was going to start with you, if I may. You're a lead scientist in the Crowther Lab, so presumably you two know each other. And I guess I'm sort of curious, maybe just sort of what do you think of the index, which then gives us a sort of another way into understanding a little bit more about it?
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me well enough? Yeah. So I guess unlike many of the other people in this room, I am an ecologist, a forest ecologist. And so this is my background and this is what I work on. And so I think from my perspective, how we understand this index, I think it provides a step change in how we assess biodiversity. So I think often when we assess biodiversity, particularly at broad scales, we look at very simplified metrics. So we will look at number of species if we're just looking at ground-based metrics. Or we'll look at what is called the NDVI, which is a vegetation index, which just tells us how much vegetation is at a site. Whereas what this does is it brings together a kind of a wealth of different aspects of biodiversity and condenses it down into a single metric. And so I think I just want to check what the question was again. So
you can answer it any way you want. I guess, trying to throw different perspectives on Tom's presentation and the underlying material, sort of, what do you think of the index? Does it, through your professional expertise, provide a way, perhaps the best way, of understanding biodiversity?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was saying with my explanation, is that what we want to do is we want to take this kind of broad wealth of information that we have as ecologists and translate that through into a metric that is understandable and tractable and flexible. So I think currently a lot of our metrics are, we use I think a lot of people use the IBAT metric, which is one of these a biodiversity metric which is based very much on species richness and endangered species, which is really useful for conservation policy. But when we want broad scale, landscape scale identification of where is a biodiverse site and where is not, it's not actually that helpful, particularly in managed systems. And so I think that's where this really comes in. It enables us to make these really broad scale estimations about biodiversity. And I think so far, when we look at lots of these kind of natural markets, we focus on single metrics. So we focus on carbon. And carbon isn't always scaled with biodiversity. So for a plantation, as Tom was saying, plantations can be carbon dense, but they can be biodiversity poor. And those carbon dense plantations are often lacking in resilience. So when you don't have many species, if you have a pathogen, if you have a disease go through, if you have a drought, they can be very vulnerable. And so more complexity brings in more resilience.
Got it. Thank you very much indeed.
Helpful?
Completely helpful. All super helpful. Although most of these people understood it all. At least, yeah. Rüdiger, I'm going to come on to you if I may. So you kind of bridge the world of science and the world of markets. Yeah. So it's a sort of, if you like, first pass into, in a way, the core of the conversation. If the financial community and broader business community thought there was really a single metric they could use for biodiversity, they would be ever so happy, just ever so happy. It would just make their life so simple. So does this work in markets, or what kind of markets does this work in?
So Simon, thanks. When we talked a bit before, you told me to be bold and to be big. So let me develop a vision of the future here. Okay. So first of all, just an event like building bridges, what we have here shows that there is just a tremendous demand for understanding biodiversity, trying to think how finance can help it. But for that, we need to measure it. And if we are just looking at, in general, environmental, social, and governance investments, one of the reasons why CO2 solutions have been so successful is that you can actually measure it. You can say, here's a company, and that company emits 1.2 million CO2 equivalent tons. And so then you can compare it, you can standardize it, and you have a certain metric. And the better the metric is, of course, and the more you can quantify it, the more exciting investors can become. Because on a broad scale, a passive investor can all of a sudden look at 1,000 investments in publicly listed firms and can compare them. And so just in that sense, I will give the ETH system some credit that the biodiversity measure that is developed within the ETH system is solid. Although the ETH is the second best polytechnical university in Switzerland, just to make sure that we understand that. And EPFL, the French one, is the better one. Having said that, more concretely, so here's a vision of the future. We have a multinational company all over the world, and with this biodiversity index, we can actually disaggregate the 50 billion company. We can look at where the plants are. We can measure the impact of biodiversity, either by having an evolution of when a new plant is being built, how biodiversity deteriorates, or by having an otherwise similar plot of land and to compare those two. Then we can take all of these different plants, aggregate it back up, and get to a biodiversity score of this particular company. This biodiversity score of the particular company, we can compare to different other companies that work in the same industry, and we can make a relative assessment of the biodiversity score, for example. Then in a second step, we can say, okay, this is the biodiversity impact. People talk about nature-intensive companies and nature-positive companies. So most of the classic companies, industrial companies that we think about are probably nature-intensive companies. We can assess the damage that is being done by some companies to biodiversity, and these companies then can help finance or co-finance nature-positive companies like the ones that are already on the Restore network. And so how could this happen? It could happen through a negative biodiversity fund where the companies with a negative impact on biodiversity support the funding of nature-positive companies. Lots of different things that you can do, but it's all the measure that is important.
But really, let me kind of push back slightly. So if I'm an investor and I'm looking at a company, actually I don't really care whether they're destroying biodiversity. I want to know whether they're dependent on biodiversity. Yeah, and I'm not really interested in biodiversity. It's just that it's a company that makes paper, so they need a lot of water. Yeah, so I'm only really interested in the water bit. Yeah, and all this biodiversity index stuff doesn't really bother me terribly unless I'm a really nice guy, which I'm not. And so where does this index fit into the reality of what information investors really are looking for, which is often nature-related risks, sometimes upside opportunity, and they have a view not about the whole of biodiversity, but there's just one bit of ecosystem service that they know is really critical to the business they're thinking of investing in, and frankly, they're not really interested in the rest.
Yeah, so you are painting a grimmer future than I did, but you can use the same thing for risk assessments, no? In the same way that you would have at the global platforms. Right now, you log into your favorite financial system, you go to the company of your choice, and you see their exposure to natural disaster risks, to flooding, and so on and so forth. You could have a biodiversity risk factor or risk impact where you can look at the risk metrics. We can always use kind of any kind of, be it an ESG solution or be it an ESG factor or be it a biodiversity factor, one, to assess kind of what is being done, and two, to assess the risks. So I don't see a contradiction here. If you are kind of if you are the type of investor who wants to maximize shareholder value, then still such an index could be useful by looking at a relative exposure of the company.
Okay, I'll take that and we'll, I'm sure, go into a bit further. Pernilla, maybe I could come on to you. So you're from Imperial Business School, and I'm assuming you would have stood up very early on and understood pretty much everything that Tom was describing. I guess it builds a little bit from Rödiger's points, which is, where does this fit in to sort of classical business processes, classical financial tools and so on? Kind of, does it fit in, or do we have to build some completely different business process and architecture to make use of an index like this?
So, I mean, to be honest, I didn't get up at the very beginning. I got up when you said 50%. And I have to say that if you talk about biodiversity index, I was more comfortable with the index bit than the biodiversity. I'm an economist, so indices is sort of one thing, but I'm not an ecologist. But I have, environmental economics is my field. So the first time I heard about this index, I was quite skeptical. But then we were invited to join the consortium, and then I became very positive, of course, because now I have a vested interest in moving this forward. Now, to be honest, I think obviously at being at a wonderful bit of being at this stage of developing the research is that you also get to bring in all these perspectives, develop it. This is a very fast-moving world, so we have the luxury, and if we only have the ability to then integrate all these things, we can actually create a very good index, and not only the natural bit, which I'm leaving to the other experts, but to the bit where we put it to use in the financial sector, in the business sector, as you say. So there's I'm very much looking forward to the day when we have such an index, or a type of index where we can somehow condense into fewer numbers all that incredible diversity that Tom just talked about. Just to take a sort of sidestep a little bit, what for me is a bigger problem probably with biodiversity is that, and money, is that investing in biodiversity is very tricky. I think investing in nature is hard. Investing in what does it even mean to invest in biodiversity? So we have actually at Imperial Business School today, this morning, released a report called Can Markets Save Nature? Where we look at what are the options for getting more private funding, private finance into nature markets. We look at we do a global survey of the world, looking at different countries where they're already doing this, albeit at a small scale in many cases, and then we try to lift that and shine a light on it. So we're looking at 8 different investment models from around the world, ranging from the use of conservation easements in the United States, so ways in which the sale of property is directed so that nature becomes valued. It could be something that should be and could be used in more countries. The Australians are doing interesting things related to carbon markets, where they're adding on biodiversity and more, not just carbon, but other more complex aspects that can be translated and sold into offsets to the voluntary or even compliance markets, etc. And we have obviously, there's movement in Europe with net biodiversity gain legislation, etc. All this will lead to more money at least wanting to enter the market. And then we have to say, okay, and how can we actually get into the large pools of capital that are out there? Because many of the investments we see around the world today are small scale. They will be using blended finance, so public or philanthropic capital combined with small pockets of private finance. Some of these examples I would call beautiful. They're not always easy to replicate. And so we need to do something in terms of coming up with ways to scale and standardize it. And I think an index can be helpful in that respect.
Okay, that's a roundabout way of saying the index is good, but it's not really convincing. I mean, in the sense that, you're absolutely right. There are biodiversity-related markets and risks and opportunities, and you're all absolutely and completely correct. But why Tom's index or Tom and Tom's index? Why not somebody else's index? I mean, kind of why did you enter into collaboration on this particular piece of work rather than perhaps there isn't an array, but the array of alternatives?
Well, because maybe I found it a bit provocative, so I don't really believe in it. Let me join you to see what it's about. I mean, it could be that, possibly. I would also argue I haven't seen a sort of plethora of indices out there at the moment, so that's another reason for saying, okay, I'm curious about it. Let me find out more. And like I said, about the biology or nature aspects of it, I wouldn't know what to say because that's not my area. What I can say something about is obviously we need more of these because we need metrics to measure impacts. And we need to continue working and sort of giving up and saying this is too difficult. That's not really an option either. So we need to put good minds to work and to continue developing this. And this is the right time. I mean, there's so much capital out there gagging for opportunities. And so we go for that.
Got it. Okay, all right. You still got to convince her, is my read. But that's really helpful. So last question, and then we're going to have to move on. I'm not seeing any hands waving, so I'm generally ignoring everybody else. Daisy, sort of through a science lens, I mean, I know you're Tom's colleague, but are there other indexes out there that we should be benchmarking and comparing? And maybe, Tom, at some point, that's a question you might want to address as well, because you've quite rightly pointed to the work that you and the Crowd Lab have been doing, but presumably there are many other things happening around the world, all sorts of other indexes and ways of looking at biodiversity. Can you, without long time, but in a sort of nutshell, explain what really makes this different in a productive way?
It's a big ask.
Give it a shot.
So I think compared to existing indices focus very much on species. And species require ground-based surveys. That's demanding, and we need data, and we need people to go out and conduct those surveys. And it's not scalable. So I think we need something that's scalable, that we can use at the small scale and we can use at the large scale. At local scales, site-specific surveys are always going to be best. But what we want to do with this index, and what I think you can do with this index, is ingest those data. You can bring those data in and you can use those to calibrate and better develop the index going forwards. I imagine there are other groups out there developing similar indices at the moment. we don't know, we're not in contact with other groups who are doing similar things. And so I think that's something that we would like to do going forwards. And as the index kind of takes shape, I think there's lots of opportunities we were actually talking about this just earlier today on the train here, opportunities to actually try to compare existing indices with this new indices and see how they compare for multiple different locations in different ecosystems around the world. How do they work?
Listen, thank you. I know it's a bit of a kind of a rumble and rush, but I'm going to thank all three of you and ask you all to also thank the panel for some very useful inputs, and then we're going to move on to the second panel. So Pernilla, Rudiger, Daisy, thank you very much indeed. What do you think, Tom? Is it surviving? So you've given up, right? No, that makes sense. So, so with no further ado then, let me invite the second panel up onto the stage, kind of broadly the sort of industry panel, although of course we've already started talking about how this connects to the market. So Gloria Fontena, Owen Bethel, Gabriel Mitchell, Thomas Horn-Sparporth, please, if you would join me on the stage, that would be absolutely fantastic. You seem doubtful, right? But okay. Good. Can I just ask, at what point did you stand up in the earlier poll? At around just above 50%? And you were on the 90%. Right, I'm going to start with you any second now. Right, okay. And yourselves?
I hope more than 50. But
more than 50? Okay, we got quite a risk-averse mix. Oh, okay, all right. So, so obviously, what we're trying to do is to, with this panel, kind of continue a little bit on figuring how this can be useful. So, Owen, I'm going to start with you, if I may, and I'm going to start with sort of, in a sense, the obvious question, which is not specifically about the index, but sort of just give us a quick. How do you measure biodiversity in the work that you're doing? Obviously not in huge depth, because I'm sure there is huge depth in what you do, but just to give us a sort of a quick photo picture of it that allows us to compare it a bit with what we've been hearing about in this session.
Sure, yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I wanted to also start where the event started, which was around coffee. So we're obviously, well, we've clearly got a vested interest in that area. So we're the biggest coffee company in the world, and just this morning we announced a major expansion of our work in coffee to switch to regeneratively sourced coffee from around the world, to invest in measures that will improve biodiversity, using things like agroforestry and ending the risk of deforestation, and also supporting farmers around the world with their livelihoods and their income. So if you felt guilty about the first picture this morning, tomorrow make sure you drink a Nescafe and you won't feel quite as bad. On a more serious note, the two things around coffee, regenerative agriculture and also ending deforestation risk, are actually two of the biggest ways in which we can impact nature. And one of those is obviously about doing no harm or less harm, so ending the risk of deforestation. And the other is about looking at restoration through regenerative techniques. The way that we measure biodiversity is focused quite a lot around traceability. So understanding where your ingredients come from is the first starting point. If you don't know where they come from, you can't measure any impact on biodiversity. And over the last 12 years or so, we've been improving our traceability through to 100% for things like palm oil, and coffee will be at 100% in 2025. And from that point on, then we could look at those landscapes that the ingredients are coming from, and we could think about what are the relative risks associated with things like forest loss and things like unsustainable agricultural techniques. So our objectives are to reach 100% verified deforestation free by the end of this year for our main commodities. and then moving into some other commodities by 2025, and then switching to 50% regenerative agriculture by 2030. And we're always looking at new ways of gathering data on the impact of those interventions. So I think looking ahead, systems which can help assess the biodiversity impact of our projects and our work around the world would be quite interesting and useful to build.
And just a sort of quick instant purchase question, would you, based on the presentation you heard, pick up the phone to Tom?
Well, we're going to look at it in detail. I know that there are a few discussions happening already between Nestle and the Crowther team. There are other indexes out there. So, we are currently looking at things like GBS and MSA and these other kinds of metrics, which are perhaps a little bit more traditional in how they measure biodiversity impact. And we can't sit still because there's investors, as we see here, who are very interested in this topic, and we need to provide them with a sense of where we are. What's our current impact? Where do we want to get to? And therefore, to answer your question, it could be interesting, but let's see.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. It wasn't a requirement, it was just a curiosity. Gloria, let me come on to you. You work for Holcim, obviously huge impacts in all sorts of ways, and Holcim has invested, like Nestle, considerably in trying to figure out how to manage it all. And you're the water and biodiversity specialist. And I guess it's a sort of similar kicker question, which is sort of kind of how do you think about the measurement of biodiversity risk, impact, dependency, which kind of obviously echoes the question of whether this sort of works in your mind given what your needs are.
Yes, so thank you so much also for the invitation opportunity. So as you said, obviously at Holcim we have a very specific footprint, both in terms of climate aspect, but also in terms of biodiversity that comes really from extractive operations, especially in our direct operation, right? So how we are currently focusing on the biodiversity topic, specifically in terms of our land management, is we are adopting a methodology indeed for biodiversity measurement, that it's not the GPI, but for now it's something else. It's a methodology that was developed together with IUCN and launched in 2014, so we can see now how things dynamically change in this nature space. It's called BEARS, which stands for Biodiversity Indicator and Reporting System. It's basically a methodology that assesses habitats and biodiversity level, looking at the importance, the quality, and the quantity of specific habitats in our land, right? So in our operation and also rehabilitated area, and so in all our land premises. So this is the methodology that we are currently using, and it's currently a very powerful methodology. Well, first of all, because as we know, there are a lot of indexes out there. The implementation in many cases is difficult, or interpretation is difficult. And with BEARS, what we can do basically is an assessment that allows us to have a score. So basically what we get out of this local assessment indeed is a score that can be then aggregated. So we can evaluate locally one site and then aggregate it to the country level, for example, the regional level. And then the other very powerful aspect of this tool is that because it is a local assessment, it gives us important information of what are the opportunities that we have in that specific site and what are the risks and the challenges that we have. Because it's a local assessment, we can get out of it information about the actions that we need to put in place. For instance, when we assess a site, we have a list of parameters that we look at in terms of species, in terms of habitat, in terms of quantity, what's the importance of that habitat in that area. And all this information really gives us the overall perception of which actions we can put in place to improve this score. Because the point of the score is obviously we can assess the site now, then we can reassess it in 3 years, for instance, and we'll see the difference. So it's a relative score, obviously. And so this is what we are currently using, but yeah.
And question. Mm-hmm. So in nature finance, all of our partners and colleagues, reinforce the point that, in a sense, even more so than with climate, it's not possible to think about nature without thinking about issues to do with justice and equity. Yeah, and I would just be interested perhaps to hear for a second, if you could, not so much are you concerned with it? I'm sure you're concerned with it. You don't have to convince anybody of that. But more sort of, is it an integrated data approach that allows you to look at both the sort of biophysical nature side and the sort of equity, social justice side? Yeah, or are these sort of like two completely different compartments within the company's brain?
So, good question, for sure. Well, no, it's not completely different fields, let's say, obviously. I mean, the overall point of measuring biodiversity for us is what do we do with it, right? So when we have the measure, what we do. And so this is where the part of the social aspect comes into play, right? Because one thing is assessing really the biodiversity at site, and one thing is, okay, we need now to develop measures. And this is mostly well done when we have the capacity to integrate and to really interact with the social component of the area. For instance, working with local conservation groups has proved a very good practice that we have in some countries, where we can really work with the local entities, the communities, and also really the conservation groups that are working for specific habitats or specific biodiversity peculiar aspect, and working with them, integrating this with the local needs that obviously has to do then with the community.
Do you think it works well?
In some cases, yes, it should be. It should work even better.
Right, okay, yeah. Thank you. So we're going to move, in a sense, from the sort of non-financial corp to the financial corp, just to sort of get kind of the other side of the investment equation. So Gabrielle and Thomas, really great to have you here from Pictet and Lombard ODA. And so in a way it's the sort of same question, but looked at through a sort of portfolio and asset allocation lens, rather than necessarily through an individual project assessment approach that a non-financial corp might take. Sort of how do you think about the acquisition and use of data in the biodiversity space as it relates to asset allocation, at its most basic level? Gabrielle.
Yeah, so thank you. It's also a pleasure to be here. I've been at Pictet for 16 years, and all I have done were environmental strategies. So we've been there for more than 20 years with environmental strategies. And about 10 years ago, it became very clear that we had to look beyond climate change and look at other metrics. And that's when we started looking at biodiversity. The problem we had then is that getting data from companies was very difficult. The transparency, what you get was pretty much nothing. Even on climate change, there was not so much, but on other dimensions, it was extremely difficult to do. So we had to develop our own methodology for that, and we partnered with the Stockholm Resilience Center, who had been promoting the planetary boundary framework, which looks at not just climate change, but 8 other environmental dimensions, and they set a threshold that we shouldn't cross, otherwise we get some pretty adverse impacts. And I guess most people know that today, but it was pretty new when we started looking at it about 10 years ago. And obviously one of them is biodiversity. And it's maybe the most important one, I would say myself, because all other dimensions, they influence it. If you think of climate change, ocean acidification, land use change, water, everything actually has a link with biodiversity itself. So what we did is we used an input-output model based on life cycle analysis. And we really tried to know for each company what is not just the impact of what it is doing or its operations, scope 1 and 2, but we tried to look what is the impact of all the suppliers, all the material used by a company. I guess for Nestle, it's just so much has to be taken into account. And then what is, when people use the product or how it's discarded. We wanted to have a methodology that looks at all these aspects in this. And that's what we did for the 9 different dimensions, including biodiversity. And since then, we have been rating any companies in the world based on the subsector they're active in. What is, the biodiversity metric that we can have. And the main drivers of that is for us mainly land use change, climate change is also somewhat there, ecotoxicity and eutrophication are probably the main one that we use.
And you know, we're like yourselves, you know, quite enamored by the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure and the sort of new standards that are beginning to emerge around risk, impact, dependency, and disclosure. But within most financial institutions, we find, if I can sort of caricature the point, that there's almost always a Gabrielle, and then nobody else is terribly interested. You know, that it's really, really hard to push the nature and biodiversity agenda in particular, in part because the material risk side to it turns out to be a pretty hard thing to calibrate, whereas at least the carbon side of climate, you know, we've figured out much more how to get that material risk analysis in place. And I guess I'm curious, without revealing bank secrets, whether you also find that it's tricky persuading different parts of the bank that this is a really sort of critical issue.
Well, I would say it was maybe more difficult in the past. I was managing a timber fund, investing in sustainable forestry with a forest engineer who had an extremely strong knowledge on biodiversity. And that's actually what led to the creation of this framework then. I wouldn't say that it was so difficult. I think the commitment of the bank was always, you know, very strong on environmental strategy, so that was relatively easy. What was more difficult was to explain it to everyone, or the sales force, or the clients, you know, why this framework would actually bring value for, investment strategy, because we actually built an equity-based, investment strategy based on this framework. And probably over the first years, it was actually, you know, more difficult to sell the product. But today it has completely changed, and I would say everybody kind of agrees, you know, that it is very important. They have seen the performance of the strategy, which was very good. We have even backtested, you know, the biodiversity metric itself over the last 10 years, and actually one of the metrics that brought the most performance to the strategy. So we were able to show that over the last decade. So today it's more, you know, it's very different. It's more, getting more precise, doing more analysis at the company level, doing more engagement with companies. We can go way beyond that, and that's you know, a very big difference and a huge acceleration. Now we kind of know with COP15, and you know, everybody's talking about it. We talk about it today. So
the bank's got it. Okay, just before jumping on to you, Thomas, just 2 seconds. I just want to swing back to Owen and Gabrielle for a second, which is, I know you're not responsible for shareholder relations, but I am curious as to whether you've had sort of the phone call from your respective heads of shareholder relations asking you, I've got a bunch of questions from investors here about nature and biodiversity. What on earth am I going to say to them? Does that come through at all yet from that end of the shop, or not yet?
So I do quite a lot of investor engagement, and yes is the answer. Yeah, we do get quite a lot of questions on biodiversity. They're pretty high level at the moment. You know, do you have a target? What is the sort of strategic approach? And for us, it's relatively easy to answer that, because pretty much all we're doing on climate has a nature impact. The challenge is really then measuring the effectiveness of that nature impact, and I think that's where, you know, better data can play a role.
Got it. And particularly on the sort of the financial risk side, I guess, rather than necessarily the sort of straight sort of impact-focused investors. Gabrielle?
Yeah, so I think what we are seeing is that there's more and more growing interest in terms of really impacts and risks in the nature space. So we see more and more questions coming up from the water and the biodiversity aspects that are also increasing in terms of depth, right? So before maybe it was really just a question, yeah, it's a target, or what are you measuring? And more it's becoming a holistic approach. So how do you approach the overall management in terms of water and biodiversity? So I think we are seeing this growing up, and it's definitely something that will keep on growing even further.
Brilliant, thank you. Thomas, sorry to hold up the engine. So Lombard ODA has more nature-related advertising than any other financial institution on the planet, I suspect. Yeah, and that's a good thing. Yeah, I don't mean that in any critical sense at all. But it really suggests Lombard ODA kind of wants to not just communicate, but really take a leadership role in the nature finance space. And so I'm, obviously there's, we're here in a way to talk about data, but I'd love you to spend sort of a couple of minutes on what you think are the real sort of deltas, in a way, the differences between the rest of the financial community trying to get their head around nature-related risk that Lombard ODA is taking on, and then maybe bring it back to the data question, which brings us here today.
Sure. Let me first of all start by saying some of the things that I really like about this index. The fact that it's using spatial data, remote observation. And the reason why I like that so much is that we know very few companies, with some exceptions, are today disclosing this data. So if we really want to screen very diversified investment portfolios for these risks, we cannot rely just on self-disclosure, and we need these kind of approaches. So one of the things that we're doing when we started our current team, some of the first type of expertise that we brought on board was geospatial analysis, to use indeed remote observation, machine learning. In this case, we worked with Oxford instead of the very fine efforts being done here on some of these efforts to try and get over that disclosure barrier and try to start screening companies for what it is. And we're looking at things at whether assets are in biosensitive areas, whether we can see, also using machine learning, whether we can see deforestation. We're now doing a lot of work on soil organic carbon, which is maybe an example of a simplified metric that is maybe a proxy for a wider range of issues, but where you get back into the debate over simplicity versus complexity. So those are some of the things we're doing, but maybe I can also speak a little bit about some of the challenges that maybe you're alluding to as well. And let me first start with the biggest one. I speak under the control of some of the scientific panel here, but my feeling would be that of all the industries we could look at, this one with a single highest impact or relevance to biodiversity would be everything related to the food system. I'm guessing there's consensus on that point. Now, what we do have databases on where some of the assets of Owen's company are located. We know there's some not too far away, here in Switzerland, near Lausanne, etc. And we can look at the biodiversity impact there. And I'm guessing we're going to see quite a nice picture. What I don't have as much visibility of is the full agricultural supply chain. Again, with some exceptions. Sometimes I know roughly the country that a commodity is coming from. Can I trace this down to the very local farm level that I'm sure you will tell me is actually the level that you need to look at? Not yet at the moment. So perhaps for us, the biggest constraint in using these metrics more effectively is not the metric itself. It's actually knowing where to look and having that transparency on supply chains. A second challenge that I would associate with this, we've had the same challenge about these multiple dimensions. And as I mentioned, we look at deforestation, biosensitive areas, organic carbon, and we could also roll that up in a metric and give it a score from 0 to 100. That becomes quite problematic. Because when I go to our clients and say, if you just invested in that portfolio, you would get a score of 67. Guess what? I give you a score of 72. Aren't you excited about this? And the problem with some of these indices is in the communication of them, that you lose a little bit of the real world meaning. And one of the things why I think the Paris Agreement has, for all its flaws, had some success, is that this physical metric of 1.5 degrees Celsius as the key target is a physical metric that has some real world meaning. And I do think, and I'd love to work more with the Crowther Lab on that as well, thinking how you make these indices a little bit more communicable. And the final point, I'm sure I'm speaking too long, relates a little bit to that as well in terms of how we define what we would call a more forward-looking dimension there. If I look at different companies, again, it would be very easy to conclude, oh, all the food companies in my portfolio are terrible, and all the legal companies that sit in a cushy office in London are wonderful because they have no biodiversity impact. What you don't want investors to do is therefore to divest the entire food system because it seems to have a higher biodiversity impact. What we really want is not just a metric that tells us, hey, there's a challenge here, but also tells me what exactly do I expect of these companies and how quickly should they improving? What's the benchmark? What's the pathway for that? So those are also some of the issues I think we're thinking through, hopefully together with the scientific community.
Thomas, it's helpful. Just hold the mic for a second because I'm going to kind of do a run back to just pick up short answers given the time we have available to just one last question. It's sort of precedes handing the mic back to Tom for a couple of minutes. And so in many ways, your comments are sort of directed at him. Yeah, sort of think about it in that way, kind of. So if you were going to say to Tom, look, you know, if you're going to put all this effort in, you know, make such a big deal about what you're doing, you know, and you're producing this index, you know, if you really want to make it useful to me and my organization, this is what I need. Kind of, this is the one thing that if you can't give me this, doesn't work. Yeah, just sort of design advice from the market, if you like. And maybe we could just do a sort of quick run with the same question across the panel. Can I start with you, Thomas?
Sure, very happy to comment. And look, this is exactly what we want to be working on. We enjoy these and like these efforts and want to look for more of the data sets that we can use. But then we should also partner on identifying the bottlenecks in actually employing these metrics. I mentioned we're using soil organic carbon at the moment, and I'll explain why. We do agree it's a simplified metric, and it's not always desirable to go for these simplified metrics because you lose some of the wider complexities. But it does have some virtue, in the sense that I can give you a more physical metric saying that as soon as the ratio of soil, organic carbon, amount of carbon that's in soil, to clay drops below 1 to 13, that soil essentially becomes defined as degraded. Now that has a bit more of a real world sort of meaning. I would love to see if for these kind of indices we can, again, attach some of these real world meanings.
So the advice is don't do an index, or?
Potentially, we have
just trying to pick up the sort of the core of it. So you know, maybe the slightly more productive question is, you know, can one translate the index back into its components? I think that's really the question that's being asked, and I think that would be really interesting to get a take on, Tom. Perfect, Thomas. Thank you very much. Gabrielle, same question.
I would agree with that.
He's the man. Just keep looking at him. Right.
Getting the components of the index would be actually great. For us, when we look at the company, we need to look at all the internet connections with, you know, everything, all the supply chain, everything. That's extremely important. And knowing the subcomponents of it, maybe some of them are more important for one company or some are more for another, and having more detail on it than just a final number would be obviously quite interesting. Another question I was wondering is, what about the oceans?
Okay. All right. Good. Great. Okay. Gabrielle, over to you.
So for me, I think it's two main things I would say at this point. It's the first one is the need for, let's say, uniformity and acceptance in terms of the different framework. We're looking, for example, at TNFD, SBTN, and many frameworks being developed, and this is where we need to have uniformity, and where I would see definitely the power of such an index to be able to become really useful and implemented on a large scale. So this is the first thing. And then the second thing, from a really practical point of view, is in terms of capacity buildings within companies. So how do we implement this? I mean, how do we, for instance, as of today, start doing this in the companies, right? And this is where I think it's really a crucial aspect of practical and efficiency in the use of the index.
Yeah, I think both seem, this sort of question of, does it work in all these different platforms that are evolving? Yeah, or does one have to sort of create one's own Tom plus Tom risk management system? And one just can't use, the ones that are kind of evolving out there. So, can one really stick it inside the tools and instruments that are being developed as we speak, and that many of us are investing in, agreeing to adopt, and so on and so forth? I think that's really, really super helpful. Owen, over to you.
Yeah, I'd agree completely with what was just said. In addition, what I would say is that it would be good to integrate it into existing programs, which have already gained a lot of momentum, particularly in the food industry. So regenerative agriculture, I bang on about it because that's such a crucial part of what we need to do to address both climate, nature, and social issues in farming. So how does this indicator marry up to the regenerative agriculture movement? And in addition, how does it fit into nature-based solutions and that whole topic around reforestation? And I'm sure it's a fairly easy match, but it's more about the semantics of how you link those two or three things together. And then second point would be, how do we make sure we leverage data that's already been gathered? So You know, we've worked with Airbus for more than 7 years now on satellite monitoring of palm oil. I'm sure that could be a feedstock for your system, probably is already. But again, just to make that point that we've got a lot of information that should be used and not sort of put to one side.
Great, super. So I'm going to take the chair privilege of asking another couple of questions of you, Tom, because I think those questions are all much too easy. And then I'll hand over to you for a few minutes, if that's okay. So I'm curious. I think actually, Owen, it leverages your point, which is, you know, all these different data sets out there. Is the index a sort of fulcrum for them, or is it a substitute for them? Yeah, and so there'll be more and more data sets, more and more branded data sets, more and more people selling data. You know, do we have to set all those things aside, which will be a massive innovation space, or actually are you providing a way in which we can begin to crystallize them and use them together, and kind of the interoperability between different branded data sets, because that becomes super interesting. And then my second question is really the issue of time. Yeah, which is if the index doesn't move year on year, you know, when we're continually looking at different risks, or it is too volatile, you know, that's the other possibility, has the opposite problem, then it becomes quite unhelpful for the business community and the financial community specifically. So what does that look over time? Yeah, because these time series and analytic approaches become really critical for the way in which businesses need to continue looking at their biodiversity impact and dependencies and material risks. So those two perhaps wrap in to some of the points that have been made. But before you answer the questions, and I'm sure they're all going to be just fantastic, I'd like to thank the four of you very much indeed, ask all of you in the audience to thank the team very much here for providing some really helpful insights. And actually, if you just hang on to your seats, I mean, don't take them with you, just sort of stay sitting for a second. And Tom, I'm just going to invite you up here, if I may, for a couple of minutes, just to quickly answer all of those questions, if you could.
I was nervous about giving this speech. This is way more scary. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. I've got them in a sort of order. The first point, and now I'm dyslexic, so I'm going to even read my own words slowly. If we just focus on the ecosystem services, yes, right. The first, I think, overarching one is around pulling out metrics of interest. You asked at the beginning, what happens if someone's interested in water in particular, or an ecosystem service that is of value, and maybe this company is only interested in that particular value, or maybe it's soil organic carbon that people are interested in as an indicator. At a high level, it's very easy to extract those ecosystem services from the metric. They are all built from those data sets. Water is in there. Soil organic carbon is one of the most important measures in there. Everything is easily extractable. But sort of philosophically, I don't want to give it to any of you, because if we extract any particular metric and satisfy anyone's needs to focus on water, we are enabling them to make the same mistakes that they've done in the past. And honestly, in many cases, water does correspond very well with ecosystem health and biodiversity. In many cases, soil organic carbon is, in fact, even more cases, soil organic carbon really does correspond well. But in some circumstances and in some ecoregions, you can see negative correlations between any individual metric and the health of the overall system. And it's for that reason that I'm quite against the idea of extracting individual metrics. So it's something that I like to continue the conversation, but straight off the top of my head, I'm not that keen on it. But of course, it's a thing that we can do, and so I'd like to learn from the experts. The next one, I think, is the bigger overall topic, which is sort of comparison with other metrics, with other approaches out there. And so for a sort of very quick overview summary of the sort of landscape that exists in terms of biodiversity assessment, there's two extremes. On one, there's the assessments that do a very big deep dive, a real deep dive into the complexity, the structure of the ecosystems, the soil organic carbon, the structure of the forest, the diversity of the species, the integrity of the system. You know, any local ground-based assessment can go much deeper than any satellite-based observation can possibly do, because you've got people on the ground assessing the biodiversity, getting an indication of that health. These are spectacular. But unfortunately, they're not scalable, so they're accessible only to the people who can afford them. The other end of the spectrum are the large-scale observations of number of species or ecosystem integrity. These come primarily from satellites. So this is the other end of the spectrum. And these are fantastic because they have global coverage. Everyone, anywhere can apply it to their garden. But unfortunately, they lack that detailed complexity, which goes back into that same problem of focusing on any individual metric, which then comes at the expense of the complexity. So what we've tried to do is, by collapsing those hundreds of layers of ecological insights into one measure of complexity, it's sort of in between those two things. It's globally relevant, but it's also complex.
I know you can't answer all the questions.
Yeah. One more.
One that you think is fun.
Okay. It's blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I think companies should compare within sectors. I think that's a way of managing that. You know, of course, a finance company will look better than a other one. Yeah, I've already touched on that. Oceans, we can do anything for oceans that we can do for land. The difference is individual land footprints on oceans are not quite as simple because they're not as clear cut. When we impact the oceans, it's usually through ocean acidification or through large-scale fishing that has very disaggregated impacts. So it's a little bit of a different topic, but we've got all the data and the same approach applies. For compiling existing data sets, that's the point. This has been built on all existing data sets. Anything that has ever been made, we've got a team of 35 people who are just constantly updating and exploring and compiling these data sets, so nothing will be left out. It's really a framework for incorporation of any new and emerging technology, and it changes over time.
I am going to stop you, just because I'm getting the evil eye from the E4S team.
And I get to breathe
You know what
now.
they're like.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you for that very much indeed. Just take a pew again. So full disclosure, Nature Finance is really proud to partner with the Crowther Lab in trying to figure out how to bring this index to market. So that doesn't make us right or them right, but certainly our take is, having worked in the biodiversity data space as it relates to markets, particularly the financial community, intensively over the last 3 years, we are, I would say, more than intrigued, an awful lot less skeptical than we were, and a hell of a lot more excited that this index can really make a difference in shaping the way biodiversity courses into and in turn influences nature markets over time to come. You know, is it the only answer? No. Is it the silver bullet? No. All the usual health hazards apply, but actually we think this can be a really, really productive input into a space that is confused, that is full of folks trying to move rather partial, incomplete views of biodiversity into markets as if somehow that helps us understand it. And to your last point, is sort of encouraging in a way the financial community and broader business community to unbundle biodiversity into many, many parts. And if there's one thing I've learned from Tom and others over the last few months, is that then it's no longer biodiversity. And so with that, I want to thank Tom, and Tom, wherever he is, if he's still here, both panels and E4S very much for organizing this session. Absolutely fantastic session, really critical subject, and very exciting work to be done going forward. So if you join with me in offering them a round of applause, that would be fantastic. As a glorified timekeeper and announcement maker, as my last contribution to this session, I think, Eduardo, I'm meant to be saying you don't have to do anything for 30 minutes apart from talk to each other. Is that right? Yeah, you're meant to go and have a cup of tea or coffee, presumably Nestle coffee, outside. Thanks very much indeed.